These great talks. I'm very happy to have the opportunity to offer some questions and thoughts in response. And I want to take this opportunity to do some kind of category work. I'm currently writing my dissertation on mesh networks, and that necessitates a lot of thinking about what this category actually means. So I thought that in the context of these examples, I would try to share some thoughts about defining what it is exactly we're talking about, and to share some cute cat memes along the way to round out our panel here. So what is a mesh network, really? I think we could sort of think about a mesh network as this idea of a boundary object, which is an idea from Susan Lee Starr and James Griesemer, which basically means it's a kind of object that's used differently by different communities. It's a technical object that can be interpreted differently based on oftentimes one's position or politics. So it's kind of like when somebody tells you what they think a mesh is, it kind of reveals certain aspects of their political position. So for example, this is a project called GoTenna. It's a commercial wireless mesh device. It operates on the 900 megahertz frequency band. And the vision here, they imagine that this device would be the basis of a coast-to-coast mesh network that's based on an open API, but within this proprietary platform. So this is maybe a mesh in some sense. To offer a different example, this is a fairly new class of products that offer mesh networks for your home. Devices like this are available from Linksys, Netgear, Google, and many others. And these are mesh routers that are sold to consumers as a way to interconnect more devices in their home over Wi-Fi. So I guess this is typically for somebody whose house is too big for one wireless router, which I'm completely unfamiliar with that problem living in New York City, but I guess it's a common one. And so, but what's interesting here is like just at this moment when we're starting to see some of these like viable large-scale mesh networking projects that are happening like in public, we see projects like this which specifically take the mesh out of the public and out of the realm of the social into the privacy of like an individual or family home and like inside like a consumer model, which I would argue kind of evacuates the mesh of any political potential. So I would call this kind of like the domestication of mesh. So this is like another class of mesh networks that we might want to consider. There's also examples like this of using mesh as a framework for sensor networks. And these might be used for like smart cities, so monitoring pollution or traffic, monitoring forests and farms for like water and nutrient levels. And here the mesh serves as the basis for like Internet of Things type technology. And so in this sense, this is like largely just aiding in efficiency and furthering kind of like economic activities. So this is kind of like the productive mesh. This is just like making business more efficient and more pervasive in, distributed throughout our cities and our lives. So this is, again, another type of mesh that we might want to think of. I think at this point, most of us are probably familiar with this old network taxonomy. This is a diagram from 1964, Rand Corporation, which, and this is one of the common ways that mesh is defined as the thing on the right. So this taxonomy positions the centralized, the decentralized, and the distributed network. And in this sense, we think of mesh networks as a technology that will kind of route around or subvert authoritarian control. But in response to this, I'd like to offer this diagram. And now I'm kind of repeating a lot of stuff that Brian was already spelling out. This is a diagram of Hurricane Electric. This is one of the tier 1 networks that Brian mentioned. And this is a diagram of their internet backbone. And what I think is interesting here is that this diagram basically looks like a mesh network. I mean, it looks like a distributed mesh network, but this is not at all what we think about when we use the word mesh in our common discussions. And so in response to this, I just wanted to bring up a remark that I heard at a recent mesh networking meetup. And Brian, this was actually NYC Mesh back in April. So somebody was talking, I overheard a comment where one of the members said what they really like, what really means a lot to them about mesh networking is specifically what Brian was saying. It's the idea that they themselves could somehow run a physical wire into the IXP, into the internet exchange, and directly have a physical connection to Google's physical, or to a tier 1 network like this. And as Brian pointed out, this the technical term of the art for this is peering. And so what I think is so interesting here is that what was so compelling to this person was the idea that their network could become enmeshed with something like this global distributed backbone. And in this sense, mesh networking is kind of a commitment to this arrangement of peers. And it's about some kind of sense of achieving or insisting on equality or some sense of symmetrical parity with these other intense concentrations of power. So it's like a way of taking this down to some way that we can directly participate in as peers, literally. Another kind of common term used to describe, to distinguish like this tier 1 distributed diagram from like the mesh networks that we're talking about is to then use the term community networks. But I think it's kind of important to kind of unpack the meaning of community here. And so this is from Raymond Williams' 1976 Keywords book, where community was one of the terms that he analyzes. So he writes that in some uses, the term community has been given a polemical edge, as in community politics, which is distinct not only from national politics, but from formal local politics, which normally involves various kinds of direct action and direct local organization, or working directly with the people. And so here, I think, in a technical register, we could contrast community networks with like the more formal technical idea of like a local network or a LAN, like a local area network, which is also a physically small network, but it's very different from this idea of a community network. And in this way, I think that what the word community does is it offers something a little bit more expansive and a little bit more diffuse. It kind of feathers out around the edges. And I think that kind of indeterminacy is very productive because the community network is precisely enmeshed with the community in kinds of informal ways that like a local area network as a self-contained small technical object might not do. He also writes that community is a warmly persuasive word to describe an existing or alternative set of relationships. And what he writes is most important, perhaps, is that unlike other terms of social organization, like state, nation, society, and so on, community never seems to be used unfavorably. It's never given any positive, opposing, or distinguishing term. And here's where I think we need to be careful. Well, first of all, the strength of community networks, I think, as I said, is in this diffuseness. And what I can gather from some of these examples and other examples I've been looking at is that mesh networks are successful precisely when they are enmeshed in communities of actors through complicated assemblages of other social and cultural practices that aren't just technical, that aren't just protocols. And I think, Day, you gave some great examples of like the involving small businesses and digital stewards and all these other things that actually make the mesh sort of woven into the community. But I think it's this unopposed sense of community, as in community networks, which is also poses one of the most kind of like vexing problems for this work in general. And the question, I'm curious to hear what any of you all would have to say about this, but the question this is a question that came up last month at the Postman conference here, where we were thinking about distributed technologies in relation to the rise of authoritarian populism. So at this political moment, when we're seeing this kind of like rise of populism and so on, it's so often attributed to like precisely these distributed or decentralized information networks. So the way that like fake news or information being circulated through networks like Google is making it more challenging to have an informed democratic populace, for example. So one of the main questions that I'm really stuck on is like, when do we like when do distributed networks do good stuff? When do they do community in that warm, fuzzy, favorable way that Raymond Williams alluded to? But since we don't sort of have an unopposed positive term for community, when is community bad? And oftentimes a community you can go into the bullying mob as easily as the sharing collaboration of the crowd. And I think that oftentimes if we don't interrogate specifically the circumstances of when these distributed networks do one or the other. So I'll just end with that, and that'd be my main question, I guess, if we want to have time for response. So thanks.
So Yeah, we're gonna have maybe 10 minutes for questions, and maybe if we could have our speakers hang out up here for a little bit.